Today I was joined by Christoph Hart. He's a musician, composer, programmer, and creator of the Hise audio plugin framework. We had a long conversation about his life, education, work, and of course Hise. This is a shorter version of the interview. If you'd like to hear the full version, which runs to about an hour 20, you can find it at my Patreon page. There is a link to that page below this video in the description. Thank you to my Patreon community who support my work and make this channel possible. Let's roll the interview. What was your introduction to programming? Did you start programming at an early age, or was it something you came to later?
Yeah, well, actually, I think the first time that I've ever started programming was like when I was really, really small, like 6 or 7. Because my father is an engineer and he's a bit tech savvy, so he introduced us to like one of the first computers that were publicly available. I think it was a Thomson computer, and it was one of those that you can attach to a television, and it has like this preliminary version of BASIC where you can actually write some programs yourself. And I remember making one jump and run game where you have the character A jumping over up arrows because you only have the S key set. And if you press the space bar, it jumps. Actually, this was like one of the first things that I can remember when it comes to me and computer programming. But after this, it gets very blurry and shady. And it might be possible that I didn't do anything with programming for the next maybe 15 to 20 years. And then when I started doing my studies, I had this introductory course to informatic technology. The professor taught us the basics of Java. This is where like maybe 99% of all people just like gave up and say, I don't want to have anything to do with that. But me, in the contrary, for me, it was pretty easy. So from there, I picked up and started to get into programming again. And I always had these weird crossroads in my interest between like music and informatic or information technology. And this is when I discovered the way to combine these two so that I don't have to jump around between each brain parts is by focusing on music technology. And that's also where I started focusing my studies on. At the time, I was using Contact for my bachelor thesis. The level was pretty basic and easy, but that left me a lot of room for my own development. So basically, everything from the most basic, what's an integer, what's a float, I've learned over by myself by reading internet stuff.
I think that's how a lot of us learn, isn't it? By actually, once you start doing it, that's when you really get into all the details and actually start to understand it internally rather than just being told it by somebody.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it certainly helps if you have like the preposition to understand basic logic structures and so. But if you do have that, which I think most people have, especially people who are musicians, because like certain parts of music theory requires exactly the same thinking than like programming.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, and then it's really the best thing if you have like a goal in mind that you want to achieve. In my case, it was like, okay, I want to get rid of Contact because I was hitting like the limits of wavetable synthesis by dropping samples in there. And then I discovered Juice, and I was okay. Maybe I can just like do this. And then basically I learned C++ and everything by reading the Juice documentation. Actually, maybe like 2 months into this process, I started the Hise framework. So some of that code that people are still using is still from that area where I had no idea whatsoever I was doing.
So Hise was your first experiments with C++ and with Juice. You weren't already an expert.
No. I mean, I made some really dumb Hello World examples, of course, before starting it. But I quickly realized that if I'm going to do an open source or a framework like this, I don't have the expertise to compete with like an industry standard like Contact at the time. The idea of making it open source is that soon like the real professionals will take over and dissect the code and give improvements. Basically, this was the reason why I chose to go open source at the beginning, and then it developed from there into it is what is nowadays.
I think that's really inspirational, because I always thought you must have been doing this continuously from such a young age, and you've just always been programming and you've always done C++. But to know that for you it was only, what, in the last 10 years or so that you've started
maybe,
C++?
I mean, we can go back to GitHub commit history to see when
yes, but that shows that it gives me more motivation, I suppose, to learn C++. If you can do it in that many years, maybe I can pick up something. So I suppose that's for everybody listening as well who's into programming, that would be an encouragement to try at least with C++ or another language that you're interested in, because you've come so far in such a short space of time.
Yeah, sure, of course. I mean, C++ has this weird or almost infamous sphere around it, where it's okay, it's only for the real pros that exactly know how memories is laid out on the CPU and stuff. But the beauty of it is you can go down on that level, and at some point you have to do it. But C++ has developed pretty well in the last decade or so, I would say. So I think with the introduction of the standard C11, I think it was, this was like the first reiteration of the C++ standard after, I think, 15 years or so. And it really took that giant leap from basically being a language of the 90s to being a modern programming language. And it took me, I mean, I started like maybe a year before that. So it took me, back when I learned the old C98 style, it took me like 1 or 2 years to adapt to the new model. And from then on, there are iterations over, and each 3 years a new iteration of the standard comes out. Also, like libraries and frameworks like Juice really make it easy because they have a really consistent coding style. I think right now, or for me, the best way to learn C++ was just like reading the Juice documentation and the source code, because I think it's one of the best code libraries ever written. So regarding coding quality, consistency, naming, it's really everything top of the line.
I do find I'm sometimes digging into the Juice references just to find how to tweak certain things in hise, and yeah, I found it to be very well written, very clear, even for a non-C++ programmer.
Yeah, I mean the beauty is I could like the entire structure of hise, how it is built with like the graphics, for example, the graphics panel and the API. It's just like a 90% wrapper around the calls that Juice are making. So I can expand on that really well foundation of a C++ framework and just like slap like an UI layer on top of it and offer some scripting wrappers.
What do you think of the acquisition by Pace of Juice?
First of all, I'm really happy that Juice didn't went down the toilet with the Rolly bankruptcy. I mean, I don't have a look behind the scenes, but I can imagine that at some point there was a decision to keep Juice alive instead of putting it to the concourse material of Rolly. And so I'm really happy that didn't take place, and that they're like that there are still like 3 to 4 really good C++ developers maintaining the Juice code base. So, but I'm really happy if like a financial viable company is able to maintain Juice. So, yeah, I mean, it's a double-edged sword. And at the beginning, I was like a little bit afraid that Pace is going to push their iLog a little bit too much on the Juice community. But actually, this didn't happen. And I think they are really smart to not do that.
Yeah, that's good. I suppose with it being GPL license, it would be hard for them to force any changes through. So I think they're just sort of maintaining it kind of as it was. I don't know. Maybe they'll market the iLock stuff a bit more towards Juice developers.
Yeah, I actually I'm a little bit surprised that there isn't like a iLock module already that you can just plug into, but maybe there isn't. I haven't looked actually.
Going back to when you were at university, you studied maths, is that right?
When I got out of school, I had no idea what to do. So I just enrolled into like the things that interested me, because it was clear, okay, I will take like 1 or 2 years to study something, and then I will do something proper. And the only combination that was available, because I even missed like the deadline for applying, where you had like where the grades are taken into account. So I could only pick from a very, very limited set of studies. And I went with a combination between mathematics and philosophy, but it was for college education. So how do you say in English? In German, it's Lehramt. If you want to be a teacher.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So basically, it was for me it was totally clear that I won't be a teacher at this point. So, but the studies were exactly the same. So after like 6 years, you would start with some pedagogic stuff, and this was really interesting for me. But when I really dug into these mathematics studies, I quickly realized that like there's one part of my brain that is coming short, and this was like the musicality and creative side. So when I switched like to another study, I kind of picked the other end, where it's like intellectually under complex, but like more or more suitable towards like the creative development. Also, this was also like not the right path to go. So after I finished this study, I also did like some proper music composition studies, but with like an emphasis on film scoring at the university in Potsdam-Babelsberg.
And do you think having the maths education helped with programming? And how essential do you think a maths education is to becoming a good programmer?
To be honest, I almost forgot everything I learned in this year of math. I mean, I can vaguely remember that I did some logic courses in the philosophy study. This really helps once you understand that like the way how you actually think is not how the world is. And even if you like combine two facts and think, okay, if one is true and the other, then one of them is true, like these kind of and or connections are like really just like constructions of the mind to cope with the reality. This was like really groundbreaking for me, because I really started to combine or to think about logic structures in the end. So, but like for the actual math study, it was like it simply was too abstract for me to make any sense. So yeah, but I really think the ability to zoom out and analyze a problem from like a bird's eye view and try to make logical solutions. I'm not sure if that's something that you can teach or learn. Also, I think that's something that's like predeposited. Or,
I know the word you're trying to get to, but I can't get to it either.
yes, or preposition. I think it's. Yeah, I think we both know what I mean.
It's a natural talent.
Yeah. Let's call it that. Yeah.
Talking about your more musical side as opposed to the programming, do you come from a musical family? Were your parents musical?
Not quite. So my father always had this alto flute lying around that he annoyingly could only play one song with. But my parents, I think they really try to give us like any kind of education that we need, both for my sister and me. So they were really encouraging when we wanted to learn some instruments. And I also started with playing the flute as like a 7-year-old kid. And then, I quickly realized that this is not my cup of tea. Then I switched to piano like 1 or 2 years later. And from then on, I was taking maybe like 13 years of piano lessons. So my main instrument up to this day is still the piano. I can remember that I was losing kind of interest in this entire music thing because I was playing mainly classical pieces on the piano. And then that's where my parents went and bought me like a digital piano from Yamaha, where you could also like create rhythms and play and create like record MIDI data, use different sounds and so on. And I think that is what saved me, what saved my interest for music. because then I started into like music production, where I made some hip hop beats back when I was 15, 16.
After you completed your degree that was in Stuttgart, then you said you went to Potsdam for your master's. It was around this time that you started doing the theatre productions. How did you get into that work? Was that through somebody you met at university?
Actually, it was an old friend of mine who went to Hamburg and studied stage design. And back then he met a director who was also studying at that time, and they kind of joined forces and are working since then. In German theater, you have these like freelancing theater groups that always consist of 4 or 5 people. So the director, the stage designer, costume designer, and music composer. And the 5th position is usually like a video artist that popped up only like 3 to 4 years ago. So, but back then, when they like finished their studies, they tried to like fill the vacant positions. And so the director asked my old friend if he knows any musician. Actually, I thought for years that he said, at that point, he said, yeah, talk to Christoph, he's cool. But what he actually said was, no, I don't know anybody. And then it went along. There was another friend that we also, like, we were like a really big community back when we were in school. So and most of them went into the theater area. So there was like another friend from that time who is an actor, and he also asked her, and then she said, oh, maybe you ask Christoph, he's cool. And then he asked the stage designer, Jonathan, and he said, I don't know. So, but he went on and contacted me anyways, and we started. We met at some point, and it was really like a really nice meeting, and it was pretty clear at the very start that we went along pretty well. But I kept on working for like 2 years, still thinking that my old friend got me this job. So, and at some point, he didn't recommend you at all. So it was quite funny.
And on those productions, what are your responsibilities? Is it all backstage stuff, or do you perform in the shows as well?
No, it totally depends on the production. So, I mean, I'm extremely lucky because the director turned out to be like one of the most successful directors in theater, in German theater. Or we had the freedom to really try out things which are not like bound by external pressure or like I mean, a budget, of course, but it's not like that if you're starting out in theater as a director, it's really, really hard to start establishing what you want to do for yourself. So at the beginning, you're really happy if you find a theater that lets you work. So they establish like the context and the conditions. And we were really, really happy to like surpass that stage very early. So the stuff that we could do was very very flexible, and that also like reflected in the requirements for each music, for each production. So whether I was on stage or not was just like dependent on like what does the production need at that point, and up to this day it still is. So yeah, basically it's kind of any form of music that you want to recreate. And at this point, it really helped having these film scoring studies really helped, because like as a film composer, you're also like you have to be very versatile because each film project requires another style of music. I mean, in the latest years, I'm slowly progressing towards mainly electronic music. But at the beginning, like every production was completely different music. But it was really nice for me working in theater, because you don't have this commercial reduction of musical emotions that you usually have in film scoring, especially in Germany, where like the requirements for film score is really, really basic.
And how many of these productions do you do per year?
Yeah, well, I heavily downscaled that. So back when we were starting out, I was doing like 4 or 5 productions a year, which basically was like a full-time employment. meanwhile I was doing this, I was also like working on hise and learning C++. And at some point I realized that if I want to move this ahead a little bit more in order to actually generate revenue, I need to downscale the other work. So right now I'm doing about like one production a year, which is nice because like I like working with these people. And also like it's the only time where I actually write music instead of just like hacking around on the keyboard and see where the buffer is overflowing. So
you've kind of touched on this already, but what was your main reason for creating hise rather than just creating instruments directly in C++?
Yeah, so basically I dived into C++ with the sole goal of making that prototype of the clarinet that I had on Contact to work in C++. So I made a list of all things that I need to have. Okay, sample playback with streaming, wavetable synthesis, some kind of convolution, okay, modulation system and so on. And I implemented these like one after the other. And then I will say that basically that's like just a toolbox for other things. And I can imagine that almost every C++ developer who implements software and audio plugins has their own set of toolbox. So for me, the question was not whether I make a toolbox, a framework, or just a product, but why I decided to make this framework public and open source. I kind of realized that like the audio industry requires a little bit more of that open source spirit, because there are a lot of like I would say like black magic, not wizardry, but like snake oil. But it's really easy for people to overmarket something and say, hey, that's the newest stuff, because it's a black box and people cannot really look behind the scenes. Also, if you look at other industries like web design or web browsers, like having a proprietary framework for web design would be totally unimaginable. So basically, it was like the lack of open sourceness. I mean, aside from Juice, which also maybe that's also like a really big reason, because I understood that I could only learn or get so far because there was like another guy, Julian Storer, who was 10 years ahead of me, and he decided to open source his toolbox for the rest of the audio community. So if he wouldn't have done that, I wouldn't have be at this position. So I thought, I mean, it sounds a little bit cliche, but like it was like my way of giving back to this, which at that point was not something of very high quality. So, I mean, it was like, it was like most basic, but I kind of underestimated the fact that once you start going open source, there's no way going back. So I'm not 100% sure whether I would still whether I would go open source again, or if I would choose like an intermediate model where I'm trying to get a group of developers who then work together on something, but not make it available to the public for now. But since it's now open source, and it's kind of pointless to speculate.
So what happened to your clarinet? Did you succeed?
That's like a really tough question, because I had this weird perfectionism when it came to that clarinet, which made me like lose myself into like tweaking details and trying to making it even better. And I think every time I got to a point where I would say, okay, now I can release it, there was like some external event happening. For example, the first version of the clarinets from sample modeling, I can remember writing the manual and preparing for release, and then I got a newsletter email from them say, hey, the clarinet is out. And I said, they sound so much better than my stuff. Back to the drawing board. Also, like I thought that I have no interest like in really marketing products, and I know for like a product to be successful, you need to allocate at least half of your time to doing that stuff. Like also when I did the calculation of how much revenue this might generate versus how much work I have to put into marketing, it wasn't really worth it for me. actually the reason why I made hise never saw the light of day. So it's still like it's even not like at the state where I could easily load it and play around. It's just like somewhere buried on my hard drive.
Yeah, I think we've all got projects like that.
Yeah.
And what you said about the marketing is definitely a huge part of being a successful, not just sample library developer, but I think any software developer or any product really. If you can't market it and you're not inclined to go into all that business side of it, then it can be quite difficult to make success out of it. I struggle with that as well. I think with plugins, one thing that really helps nowadays is we've got these sites like Audio Plugin Deals and Plugin Boutique, and they can essentially do a whole load of marketing for you, which makes life a bit easier.
Yeah. I know. I mean, there are a few people who work with hise who started out as really single guy companies, and they seem to do okay at this point, which is great. But for me, I also like had this once that hise became a thing. I also like realized that I want to allocate like most of the time into actually writing that framework. On the other hand, same with the music. If I'm just offering a framework without like making any products with it, it's kind of pointless. So but this is aside from the fact that it's much more easy to generate revenue with end user products than with a framework for developers. These are like the reasons why I'm still, or why I'm developing like or working with other companies to actually build stuff with hise.
Yeah, so Audict is the most sort of visible company that you've worked with directly. How did you get involved with them?
Actually, Dorian from Audict, he reached out to me at some point, and I think he had this modular synthesizer in mind that he couldn't do in Contact. And I mean, I was doing a few collaborations with other people with hise before, but what I really kind of enjoyed at working with Dorian is that he left me enough room to shape like how the product looks from like a pure technical perspective, where I can say, okay, like this is really like a bad idea architecture wise, but basically this feature comes for free, so let's why don't we push that in? So the collaboration went really fine with him, and then we released Hextrack together. And looking back, I would never ever do something like this again on the scripting language. I think we did a little bit. We did a little bit too complex, and then we had to like cope with all the backlash that people on lower systems couldn't run it and stuff like this. So we weren't the smartest people when it come to planning the release cycle. So it was like crunch phase till Thursday before Black Friday to make it happen. So yeah, but I kept on working then and pushing out updates in Hextrack, but having like this really overly complex instrument that I needed to bring to some performance levels that are considered normal in the audio context really helped like shaving a lot of CPU cycles of, for example, the modulation system in hise. Then the next big project we did was PerkX, which I still like very much to this day. And that's where we really got crazier, because we coming from the experience of Hextrack, where we said, okay, we have this massive modular synth, and now we want to do even something even more complex with the piano roll, where you can edit MIDI notes. Said, okay, we won't do that in the scripting language, because if you know C++, it offers you some feature that the scripting language can never offer you.
And it's much faster as well for real-time things.
Yeah, but like the actual performance wasn't the deciding factor whether we should do in PerkX. It was more like the nightmares that the development and debugging of a piano roll turn out. I mean, I really worked on the debugging facilities on hise in the last year. So it gets a little bit better, but still it doesn't beat like the ability of debugging it in Visual Studio, where you can set a proper breakpoint and then really inspect every last bit of the CPU.
I remember with the release of Hexaract and PerkX especially, it's sort of influenced you to add certain new features, which then became part of hise, like the server stuff, for example. I remember came around the time PerkX was released.
Yeah. So exactly. Yes. So for the server stuff, we in PerkX we wanted to try out wanted to embed like a store directly into the plugin, and for that we needed some kind of server communication. Actually, I wrote the entire server logic in C++, which is, again, if I would now look back, I would never do it again, but in a scripting language. So because in C++ you send out a request and you have to really hard code like domain and API things into source code, which is, I mean, it felt really weird at that time. And now looking back, it was the totally wrong thing to do. So basically, I thought, okay, going forward, we need some kind of server API for the scripting language. And even now, if I would write PerkX again, I would kind of write the server logic completely in the scripting layer and just like use the data model for C++. So the more products you do, the better I think you can decide which part of the application has to be done with which tool set.
When was what you would call the first day that you started hise? When was hise born?
I think maybe 2014. Yes, something like that. I'm just thinking whether it's before or after the birth of my daughter. I think after. Yeah, after.
So you released it to the public quite quickly then, because I think I first learned about it in 2015.
Yeah. So basically, I started out working on a private repository. I think the first person to ever got involved that wasn't me with hise was Elon Hickler.
Yes, he told me he was the person who introduced me to it. Yeah,
and I think he also urged me to set up a forum, and then he dragged in a few developers. I think you were the only one that stuck in there. So like for the next 2 years, this forum was just like a private conversation between the two of us. But then it somehow it picked up steam at some point.
Yeah, so that was something I was going to ask. So you built the framework that can make sample libraries and virtual instruments and effects, but you also built this community.
At the beginning, I was just like blindly following the path that Juice and Julian Storer set out for me. So there was also a forum which was very active for the Juice developers, which I was also very active at the beginning, trying to learn as much things as possible. But I think this stuff comes hand in hand. If you have like an open source framework which is intended to be used by other people, the ability of talking, of having or offering the people like a space where they can talk about it, I think is like embedded into this idea. But I'm not sure which one of us is responsible for actually building this community.
It's definitely you. It's definitely hise. Without hise, there wouldn't be any of it.
Yeah, but I can also, without like your work on explaining all these features, I think it would still be like a private conversation between the two of us.
Yeah, I suppose I've directed a few people towards hise. I do. If it ever comes up in conversation, that's where I steer them. I guess that's because I just think hise is the best platform for this sort of thing. In such a short time, you have made it far superior to anything else that's out there, other than maybe writing in pure C++ or Juice. But that isn't superior from a usability point of view, just in terms of what you can do with it.
Yeah, but especially because you can cherry pick the things that you want to take from the hise code base. So yeah, but this was also like one of the ideas or things that I realized pretty quickly. In order to be as approachable as possible, hise must not only be open source but also offer like different attack vectors for developers, which come from different angles. So anybody who is proficient in C++ would never ever limit himself or herself to like only writing in a scripting language. So it's totally clear that he say, okay, where is it? Give it to me. Give me the C++ API. I don't want to do anything with your scripting language. On the other hand, people who have never written a line of code before want to like just track elements around exported and enjoy that they're able to build like virtual instruments or effects.
Yeah, it's got points of entry for every level of developer. I think the only bottleneck, in fact, is being able to set up a compiler to export. Once you can do that, you don't have to be a C++ developer. You can start at your own level. You don't even need to script for the basic things. So it's very versatile.
Yeah, but it's funny because like this entry level is source of endless discussions. Not only between online, like in the VI control thing, but also between Dominic and me. If a tool is completely free of charge and available to anyone, then it's really easy for it to be completely devalued. So it requires some kind of involvement and really willing to get to know this framework before you can actually leverage it, which is good because it people who go through that process, they lose this kind of attitude of it's free, give it to me, I'm entitled to it. I can imagine that this is like a valid point for an end user that pays money to get a product. Actually, I hate these kind of conversations. So this is for me like a way of making sure that nobody starts using hise with the wrong or with like a non-fitting mindset of what I'm trying to offer here.
Yeah, I think that's a very good attitude. You've got to be willing to go through a learning process in order to use the software properly.
Yeah. Also, I mean, like the level of that hise offers you, where you can actually create binary plugins and your own software that you need to sign and whatsoever, that basically makes you like a real software developer in the sense that you have to deal with all the annoying stuff. I don't think it would help anyone if I make the entry level easier, because at some point you have to figure this stuff out. I will rather let the people have this really, really annoying frustrating experience at the beginning than at the end, where they okay, until now everything goes smoothly. I've invested like maybe months of work into this, and now I'm totally frustrated because now I'm getting stuck and I lose this work.
The main thing as well is that it isn't really that hard to set up a compiler. It's, especially on Windows and Mac, just install. So as you've been steering this ship that is hise, the community makes lots of feature requests and bug reports and things, and I think you've been very good in responding to that. I've known other developers of open source and proprietary software who don't take kindly to feature requests. They regard their community as a nuisance, but you really seem to be open and willing to listen and discuss things. Is that something that you've had to adapt to, or is it something that's natural to you?
I think what really, really helps, if you independent of being a software developer, I was doing lots of contract composing work where you have a director of questionable skills that tells you what to do, and it's really, really good to or like the one thing that I can take out of that experience is like how to listen to criticism without getting emotional. I mean, it's a little bit different because I was completely emotionally detached from the music I was doing back then, and now it's the framework is something different. For like most requests that are like solid, I can get where they're coming from, and also like as soon as I'm starting working on hise myself, I think there's not like a time where I'm working inside hise for like more than 2 hours before I start adding a feature or fixing a bug. So I can really understand how frustrating it is for people if they don't have this ability that I have, just like going into the source code and fixing it so I can proceed with what I want to do actually. Yeah, also like I'm really grateful for for the feedback if it's reasonable, because it really saves me the time of really trying to figure out every possible use case and which bugs might occur. So this is also like, for example, the server API. I didn't use that one in like a commercial product or in a real world project. All bug reports that come in there are really helpful, because it will save me the time when I will need it. So, I mean, bug reports are seldom annoying or like useless. But like some feature requests are like so completely out of touch or out of what I would expect. But actually, I mostly don't respond to them, and somebody else says, "Hey, that's not the best idea in the world." So that's fine for me.
Yeah, the community takes on some of the support role that would otherwise fall to you.
Yeah, I think I like the really beginner entry level problems are all taken care of by the community, which is like a really massive thing to be taken off my workload. So,
what are your long-term goals for Hise? Is it something you see yourself still working on in 5 or 10 years?
I haven't really started this project with like a milestone project management plan and like a grandmaster scheme that has like world domination by 28. So I'm just like keeping on development as I go, and as long as I'm working on a project that utilizes this framework, it will always be maintained.
And you briefly mentioned the name Dominic. So Dominic's been sort of in the background maintaining the website, but he's been quite essential to your work with Audict.
Yeah, of course. Not only Audict, but also Hise in general. So basically, I've known Dominic for like maybe 25 years now. So back in school, when we were in school, we were playing in the same band. And then somehow our biographies parted ways, and he went to Hamburg doing his thing, and I was doing my thing. But at some point, when I was developing Hise, I realized that I can't do this like only on in my brain. So like I need like an echo chamber that is a little bit bigger than just myself. I was kind of looking for somebody willing to join this development. And the problem is that at this stage, it was nothing that you can present to like professional that you don't know and let like the preposition speak for itself. But it was more like in the very early stages. But Dominic is, I think, his world-class talent that he can leverage is that he's able to mimic understanding up to a point where you think you're talking to somebody who has invented this functionality. So I'm not sure how he does that. There's so black magic tricks involved in there. But for me, it's super helpful because it allows me to just formulate my problems and get almost reasonable feedback from him back. That allows me to or allows us together to think about ways how to move this code base forward. So basically, he started out as I would say just like guy that I will talk about how we can what would be nice to move forward with the code base. But since this is like a really hard to pin down, or it's really hard to pin down on the actual value of that. I mean, it's the value for me, the perceivable is immeasurable, but it's also like it's a bit frustrating to not be like really part of the development. Back when we started doing the first work with Dorian, I just said, okay, there's like this part of development which has to do with server and web development that I really don't want to be involved with. Dominic, is this something you would like to do? And he said, yeah, fine, let's do it. And he implemented all the server side stuff for all like the entire copy protection on the server. And also, meanwhile, also like doing debugging and like general like UI. So basically, he's part of the team of Dorian, me, and him who are designing the last Audict product. But he's also like we were talking about like how to move the code base forward, how to build up or how we could improve the community or whatsoever. Because people often forget, and I sometimes also forgot to mention that there's Dominic, but yeah, he's really a valuable member of the hise team. So yeah, don't be mistaken. We meet up maybe one time a week, so where we just like sit next to each other, talk about hise and implement stuff. So there's some periods in his life where he has like other projects going on, and then we don't talk so much. But he's a really steady input since maybe 4 or 5 years.
Have you had any offers from companies trying to buy hise? Has Muse Group approached you yet, or has Apple tried to buy you out?
No, not yet. I mean, in the beginning, I had some really questionable communications with a few developers, but I think they just didn't understand like the nature of open source. And I remember we were talking like 4 or 5 emails back and forth, and at this point, and then he asked me, why do you give this away all for free? Then I told him, so that's not how it works. And then I've never heard back from him. I don't see it a viable product or code base to buy for any kind of company at this point, because like the target audience is so focused, it's pretty hard to make it financially viable for like one guy for me. The fact that there's almost no competition in this area speaks for itself. I mean, there's contact, but it's like basically a dead horse that's trying to make as much money as possible until everybody uses ARM. There's also like a few companies who try to make this, but I think the target market is simply too small for it. And I really had a hard time figuring out a license model that is not like completely ridiculous for either side, because like the expectations between the framework licensee and the one who's licensing the framework, they are so different, because the price is basically, you don't have to pay anything to to release it. So that's like the baseline, and it's really hard to argue and come up with a license model that allows you to actually make this viable model that you can keep developing and writing, improving on.
So I just have one more question,
Mhm.
and that is, when is Hise 3 going to be released?
Yeah, actually, we thought about releasing Hise 4 now. So we skipped Hise 3, was like maybe 1.5 years ago.
So what are the next few features you'd like to see added to Hise?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've worked on this new layout thing, which was really, really overdue, and I'm really happy that I did it. And I'm really like the way how it turned out to be. And after this, I was working a little bit on the sampler workspace. And I think that I'm wrapping it up at the moment. So there are just like a few more things that I want to implement there. For all the other projects, we just like imported the samples, and I had this batch script running that creates the sample map. So I never ever really went into the sampler workspace. And now that I've did, I can imagine the frustration that some people have if they have to rely on these tools in there. So yeah, but after this is wrapped up, I think the last big feature addition will be like this full instrument expansion that we've talked about, and also like the exporting of the what people have called hise player in the last 5 years, which is actually pretty close. It still needs like a few missing links to put it all together. So yeah, because we tried or we decided to go ahead with that model, because it contradicts the argument I made for making it a little bit more harder for people to join the thing. Then they basically get a player and don't have to bother about compilers or whatever.
Well, that's all the questions I've got. For anyone listening who doesn't know, you can find Hise at hise.audio. And that's probably the best way to contact you as well, isn't it? Through the forum.
Sure.
Well, thank you very much, Christoph. And maybe we can do this again in a few years' time.
Yeah, sure.
See how far it's come.
Yeah. It was a pleasure.